My great pleasure. One moment, please. To welcome you to the third research seminar of the term with poets Canisia Lubrin and Molly Cross-Blanchard. Our final seminar is December 3rd, co-sponsored with Caribbean Studies, and that is Tammy Navarro, who will be launching her book, Virgin Capital, Race, Gender, and Financialization in the US Virgin Islands. So I'm just going to make a land acknowledgement. It strikes me that as different faculty members and graduate students do the land acknowledgement in WGSI, we should think about how to modify it and add to it in ways that that matter to us and that implicate us. I teach many of the experiential learning and community-based learning and community partnership classes at WGSI. And so it's community partnerships that are in my mind for our land acknowledgement. The land on which we plan to gather next term and on which we gather virtually is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Because WGSI builds relationships with Indigenous community-based organizations in our midst, I'd like to acknowledge the ongoing pre-pandemic and pandemic vital work of 4 of them. So as you commute to campus next term, you must pass at least one of these organizations. The Native Canadian Centre of Toronto, north of WGSI, the Native Youth Resource Center on Bloor to the west of WGSI, the Native Women's Resource Center to the east of WGSI, and Native Child and Family Services of Toronto on College, south of WGSI. Each of these organizations has worked with our students, and we're grateful to them and for these relationships and for the learning and for the work they do and the community that they build. So again, thank you so much for coming. It is late November. You have papers to mark. It is late COVID. You are tired, and yet this is a beautiful opportunity for us to feel rejuvenated. And with that, I pass things over to Ronaldo.
Thank you, Judy. It's really my distinct pleasure to introduce 2 poets to you this afternoon, Molly Cross-Blanchard and Canisia Lubrin. First, Molly. Molly Cross-Blanchard is a white and Métis poet living on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish land. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of British Columbia and a BA in English from the University of Winnipeg. Molly is also the publisher of Room magazine. The book that she'll be reading from, Exhibitionist, it's her first book-length collection of poetry published by Coach House Press in the spring of 2021. The Exhibitionist has been described as, and I quote, reckoning with a devastating breakup, a saucy mix of love poems, breakup poems, and musings on sexuality culminate in a brutally honest and funny collection of sorry, not sorry confessional poetry. And in another review, the Exhibitionist has been described as Cross-Blanchard's speaker could be the poet herself. And the description of desire here is tender yet awkward, fumbling. She sketches memories and lays out her longing for love and for aspirations she can never reach in language that is blunt and at times painfully honest. Canisia Lubrin is the author of 2 critically acclaimed collections of poetry, Voodoo Hypothesis from 2017 and The Dysgraphist from 2020. Voodoo Hypothesis was a finalist for the Raymond Soter Award and has been described as a work of speculative poetics, brilliantly combining physics, philosophy, and pop culture. The book investigates with a steady eye and deep moral seriousness, state-sanctioned violence against Black individuals and cultures, all while remaining rooted in a vision of Black diasporic aesthetics and imagination. The Disgraphics, it is said, continues Lubrin's exploration of Black history and Black futurities. A single long poem that is organized into 7 acts or movements, the book feels private in gesture and grand in scale, offering a piercing examination of selfhood and the forces that threaten it. Canisia has won the Griffin Poetry Prize, the Bocas Literary Prize, the Wyndham Campbell Prize, among others. And she is Professor of Creative Writing and the soon-to-be Director of the MFA in Creative Writing at the School of English and Theatre Studies, Guelph University. Additionally, she is also the poetry editor at McKellen and Stewart, better known as M&S. I get to call her my friend. And the last thing I'll say about Canisia is that just recently, Canisia Lubrin, Dion Brand, Christina Sharp, and Alison Hines endowed a prize for emerging Caribbean writers in the region. So please join me in welcoming Molly Cross-Blanchard and Canisia Lubrin to our WGSI virtual space and seminar. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thanks,
you,
Pablo.
Rado.
Either one of you can read first. Okay, maybe I should say what's going to happen. See, I broke Judith's rules already. What's going to happen is that the 2 poets are going to read for 20 minutes from their work, whichever work they decide to read from, new, old. And then Judith and myself generated some questions that we will engage the poets on. And then we'll open it up to you to ask questions of them, or just to have a conversation, really. Okay. So maybe you'll read in the order that I introduce you.
That works for me. I'm nervous. I want to get this out of the way.
No need to be nervous.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, a really kind introduction where you sort of pulled pieces from the internet. It's nice to hear those things all back to back. So yes, I'm Molly Cross-Blanchard. I am currently streaming from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, which is colonially known as Vancouver. And I live right on Kingsway, which, if you're familiar with Vancouver, is a road that cuts sort of diagonally across East Vancouver into Burnaby. And what's cool about Kingsway is that before settler contact, it used to be a footpath that cut through this really dense forest, and it was used by the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, and it was also used by the animals. And it was a vital path in their society. And so I'm grateful to have that little piece of knowledge about this place where I live, and I'm grateful to the stewards of the land. I've got a dog here, and she's got like some afternoon zoomies, and she's got really long toenails right now. So you might hear her a little bit, and I apologize in advance. Thank you to Carrie, Judy, Elisa, and the rest of the team at the WGSI for the invitation to speak today, and thanks Judy and Ronaldo for hosting. This is a really exciting opportunity for me because I'm not in any way, shape, or form an academic. In fact, when I was in grad school, my nickname was Snooki of the MFA because my work was trashy. In a good way, I think, and I embraced that nickname because I liked having a shtick, but I never in a million years thought that, you know, my fart poems and my masturbation poems and my Zac Efron poems would catch the attention of prestigious institutions. So I'm feeling especially cool right now. So this is my new book. It's my first book. I'm 27 years old and I started writing poetry when I was about 21. And before that, I was working a lot in theater and fiction writing, but then I got dumped pretty monstrously by my high school sweetheart who I had been with for 6 years and who I found out had been cheating on me with all of my friends. And so I have never before felt that kind of pain. And the poetry just started coming. I don't know why, it wasn't my genre of choice, but it felt like the only form that could hold all of my very big feelings. And the first bunch of poems I wrote were all really awful. They were so bad. But then I started reading more widely and studying the poets that I loved. And I also learned to practice restraint with some of my uglier emotions. And then my own style started to appear, and I was able to craft this collection slowly over the course of about 4 years. And the themes that came out during that writing process were a lot about shame and a lot about the body. The further I got from my failed relationship, the more apparent it became that I'd been in an abusive relationship with a narcissist who had been tricking me into feeling inadequate and dumb and undesirable to make himself feel like a big, strong man. So that was the catalyst behind this book of poems. And then as I produced new work, a whole host of other shames I'd taken on started to poke their heads out. Shame from when I was a child, to when I was going through puberty, to when I was a teenager navigating sex, to now. And these are shames about fatness and body hair and indigeneity and mental health and sensuality and periods and professional success, and even just the pop culture that I enjoyed, which for the record is 2000s R&B and romantic comedies. And then the whole book started to fall into place as I wrote towards and against these shames, and it became less of a fuck you book to my ex and more about me. A switch flicked inside me, and all of a sudden I really desperately wanted everyone and anyone to know all the things that I'd ever felt embarrassed about, as a way of taking back some of that power from my ex who had exerted it over me to keep me under the thumb of shame. So I'm going to just read a bunch of poems now. And I'm not going to talk about them too much because I've already done enough of that already. And I don't like to give away their secrets before I've read them. And I don't like to take the air out of them after I've read them. But if anyone's got questions about any of these poems later on for the Q&A, then I'm happy to speak about them. So the first poem I'm going to read is one that I usually start with because it's the title poem of the book, Exhibitionist, and it opens up the collection. Exhibitionist. The most orgasms I ever had in one go come over Christmas vacation in my childhood basement bedroom. Door cracked open, sheets peeled back, pussy in plain view of the cat clawing carpet. Is this how flashers feel in their trench coats and chest hair? I'd like to sit in the park with my thumb stuck up my nose and wait for someone to notice. I want to be more like the woman in Burger King who eats fries straight off the floor. The woman who cries in Walmart when her preteen son says, "Fuck you, Mom," for the first time in front of the greeter yanking carts. At the strip club, I eat onion rings, watch the dancer watching me from upside down in her halo of light. When will my roommate notice the way I air dry underwear on the corner of the hallway mirror, symbol of sex in his reflection? I want to feel like a display model lipstick, dug at nub smeared across the mouths of strangers, a much handled sample of the real thing. You think you know your life after Hara Lindsay Bird and birth control. You think you know your life, and then you're sitting alone in the theater with popcorn grease on your chin, watching Melissa McCarthy bumbly stumble from flattering floral blouse into flattering floral blouse 50 times in 90 minutes. Alone is what you want to be, but not feel. You think you know your life, and then you're crying because on the way to your car, you see the stars for the first time since September, and they are nothing like you remember. All your naps begin or end with porn. You could fill a diva cup with pus from the zits on your cheeks and chest. You want to fill a diva cup with blood, but your pussy's like, hold up. You think you know your life, and then you piss away 5 hours a day, half watching House Hunters reruns on basic cable and chewing polish off your nails so you can paint them again the same shade of crepe paper pink. Your life is wiping the kitchen counter and signing the chore sheet and making toast and wiping the counter and signing the chore sheet and making toast. Your life is Grey's Anatomy, when George falls heroically in front of a bus and ends up in the ER with his surgeon friends, but they don't know it's him because his face is so fucked up and swollen that they treat him like anyone else and talk shit about him while he's lying on the table, open and hurt with a tube down his throat. You think you know your life, but then you wean yourself off 21-day Marvelon, and it turns out you haven't known your life since your mom found a picture of your labia on your Nokia camera phone and sent you to the clinic for a script. You think you know your life, but it turns out the tiny white pills were tiny white liars, pressing buttons, pulling levers, saying, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Way Out, or poem I wrote while jogging on 12th Ave. If that Purolator van hops the curb, crushes my pelvis and spleen, New Balance tumbling acrobatic into the intersection free of my body, triumphant bloom of blood across my sweats. If I'm tube fed in the hospital and my body has to eat its own fat while my exes watch from the visitor's wing, distraught and horny. I'm unable to sit upright. My new job has to be done by someone else. I'm released from my contract. I'm brave, not depressed. Pointing to each purple scar, the brace around my neck, the needle pumping morphine into my wrist, I say, see, this is why. And the bosses say, you poor thing. A lawyer from the TV show Suits goes to court for me and wins a giant settlement from Purolator. I never have to work again. I heal. My body meets this dismembering with fervor, and I'm stupid beautiful. Edward Cullen has drained me of my mortal blood and filled my flesh with liquid marble. When the sexy physical therapist is testing the mobility of my new titanium hip, he can't help himself. He eats my pussy and then tells me I taste like peaches, and I really do taste like peaches. When we swap tender vows till death do us, two doves fly a heart around the sun. I famously don't care. I famously don't care about germs. I'll eat a Linty pocket mint. I'll eat dirt just for the shock of it. In the bathroom stall, I inhale another person's period. Sometimes I go in there just to pick my nose. An imagined audience watches me shit, so I cross my ankles to the side like Anne Hathaway in The Princess Diaries when she gets her hair straight and learns how not to be gross. But my hair is still straight when I touch the brownish wax on the Q-tip before the tossing. I'm such a loud puker, and I splatter on his sneakers at the park. In 8th grade, on a dare, I dunk my whole head in a bucket of gray water collected from a hole in the roof of Jesse's attic. When I come up for air and my dirty hair stops all over my shirt, he's watching Jesse make an absent-minded braid, and I don't even care. I don't even care. First time smudge. It takes 8 matches, a burnt thumb, and a quick Google search to light the sweetgrass braid Mom scored for me from an elder at work. Always use matches, she said. Spirit likes matches. I don't have the abalone shell or eagle feather, water, and air, so I just hold them in my mind, cup the smoke to my face, my left chest, down the fronts of my calves to my feet. I noticed too late I forgot to change the Spotify playlist to something more traditional. Hopefully Spirit likes Jimmy Eat World. I think about the word smudge while I coax the smoke into each corner of my bedroom, the way it might mean a smeared mark, like how the message from him apologizing for the women in my bed was a smudge on my inbox today. The way I felt when I read it, a smudging of my cool front. I want to think of the word smudge as wiping away, but to soil is simpler than to cleanse, and I'm afraid all this smoke can't smudge his spirit from the air here. I open the window, cough an acrid cough into the dark. I notice too late. The Google article said to keep it open from the very beginning. What do you do? This is the only poem I've ever written about Tinder. It's my Tinder poem. What do you do? When you brush your teeth, do you get toothpaste on the mirror, or are you a cyborg? Do you sleep naked, or do you suck? Have you ever talked to the moon as a friend? Where did you grow up? Did it have a water park? Did the fair come through every August, and did you piss yourself a little on the ring of fire? Is this haircut negotiable? Do you have roommates? Are they also blonde? Do you and your roommates sit knee to knee on a futon drinking pale ales and watching The Office while someone pours queso over a plate of Tostitos? Sorry, that was pointed. Have you been on the apps long? Have you ever swiped left on every nice-looking person because you felt undeserving of love? What time of day do you masturbate mostly? Do you think about an authority figure or a lesser mortal? Am I the kind of person who could get you hard? Don't answer that. White liquor or brown? Fucking or friendship? Land back or reconciliation? Do I intimidate you? I know you can see my areolas through my t-shirt, and yes, it's a power move, but I really am a sweet girl. Just ask my therapist from when I was 12 and too anxious to have sleepovers. Did you go to therapy when you were 12, or does your spirit stay in your body when you talk to your birth father on the phone? How many pets have died since you were old enough to feel that perverse loss? What were their names? Where on your body are they tattooed? Are you going to let me live my life, or are you going to sit me at a dinner table with your sexist friend, Stephen? Are you going to be pissy if I write poems about how much sex we are or aren't having? And if I say, okay, then I'll write about my other boyfriends. Will you throw a beer glass not at my head, but not at my head? Will your mother look at me across the yard at the engagement barbecue with pity all over her face because she knows she raised a shitbag and hopes there's something I can do about it? Should we make out? This one's a bit of a longer one. It's called This is a Poem I've Fashioned. This is a poem I've fashioned from a journal entry. Sorry. I was hysterical one night. The moon was being weird. I sent you nudes that made my ass look rounder than it is and wrote, I think we should have sex when I'm in town. I put a deposit down on a hand tattoo that Kyle says will make me look like I've been to prison. I ate half a vegan bean wrap and a piece of cheese toast and 2 cups of sweet beige coffee, and that's it. I took a pissing selfie and posted it in the ladies fitness accountability chat, #multitasking. No one liked it. Is this what feeling my whole life is like? Is what I wrote in the journal. I'd been watching Fleabag, that was the problem. Phoebe Waller-Bridge and the moon. I reminded myself that my mother and my best friend are alive. I reminded myself I have a dog, not a guinea pig. She licked my hand over and over, and I had to lie still for a while. I read some Sally Rooney, and just like that, the banana peel drying on the desk became endearing. I was endeared to myself, but now I can't remember how. Recalling drunkenness sober. I need you to love me more than I need to remember liking myself, and I'm only a little embarrassed to admit it. I hope you like my body when we fuck. I hope you say my asshole tastes like caramel again. I never forgot that. And I hope my asshole actually tastes like caramel, and you weren't just saying it to make me feel better about having a regular tasting asshole. If you haven't missed my breasts, you will after you see them in these new sheer cups. You'll miss them while they're still in your hands. All of it happened so fast. I just wanted to feel loved again by a man who loves me, to be held so normal while it's dark outside, and I wanted to smell you. This is the present tense. I want to lick your warm neck and smell that magic thing my spit does on your skin. Love really looks like this, huh? This is the transition. I'm climbing a hill or else descending quickly into a tumble. If I'm a baby's light-up toy, you're the blinking default setting. I have to be loving someone else to not be loving you. What we thought was a pressed red self-destruct button is actually hundreds of windows to be nailed shut by hand. Do you understand? This coming together is part of the leaving. Sorry. Just fuck me like you did at Disney World. I swear I'll be right there with you. And the last poem I'm going to read today is the last poem in the book, and it's called They Will Call This Vulnerable. They will call this vulnerable because it's a book written by a woman, and it checks the woman's book vibes. Heartbreak, check. Ghost children, check. Yearning, check a Rooney baby. When they call this a vulnerable exploration of womanhood, will they cite the ass stuff or say she was hurt so good? Is it vulnerable to write, I love my massive rack, or is it just a fact? I want to tell you everything, like how I fantasize about lifting a car off all four sisters, pulling dad from a burning barn, jumping off a bridge to save a Jack Russell Terrier. But then I'd have to divorce myself from myself. Vulnerability is tricky like that. Fake it till you make it, Mom always says, and here's the book. Susan asked, can the last poem be just about you? And it's a trick question because it's always been about me. When I'm staring into your face and it's like you're the only man I've ever loved, I'm really thinking about the next time I'll feel so alive. Thank you.
Wonderful, Molly. Thank you for that reading. You might have swerved away from writing a fuck you book to your ex, but you certainly did write a fuck you book to quite a lot of ridiculous social orders, including respectability. I really love the way you deal with the grotesque and the wonderful humor that you bring to it. So thank you for that. Again, thanks to Ronaldo, my friend, for being here and for convening us a long discussion along with Judith and Alyssa Trotz and everyone else who's involved in making this happen. Gathering us around poetry for some minutes in our lives is always a gift. So I will read from The Dysgraphist, which is a book-length poem in the form of a 7-act play where it really just bastardizes the form truly, because what emerges is less about dramatic structure than it is about the sort of textures and temperatures of performance and the drama of being alive in late modernity, in capitalist modernity. And each one of those acts represents a kind of inquiry into selfhood, kinship, in this current world of hyper individualism and nationalistic fascism and climate disaster. So I will read from the very first act. And let me just set my timer here for the first time in my life. Usually I just go through this thing quite intuitively, but you know. I'll read from Act 1, which is called Ain't I at the Gate. I pulls off I's toes and leaves them near the sea. I's sea. Back to the sea as before. Yet an hour's drift from Manzanilla, which is no place, but a word I loves. I knows what begins the act of saying things, what is lodged there, a promise of some life. not unlike this cold gray sky, not unlike the not good marching band a street away, throwing madness out with eyes lonely discography. Eye says, please, without toes. But what about these feet, now that they are not seized in their act of marking things, disappeared things, things given over to the gesture, the method, to the field awash and undertow? What is love but the hand returning to claim the dust, red, white, black as a coal-swept evening? Here, a burnt mountainside, seasons setting aside their obscene openings. I, whose only ever sense these 3 yards before a stiff trunk shirks off its tattoo of ringed wisdoms, or maybe years, yes, all that they are. In the mouse vein muscle, a family in a struck way budgets the death of their cousin to the obsolescing tar. Nothing like a sentimental drudge through the what-ifs. Nothing like a morning so unclear as to leave I before the opening I knows where to find. Unlike the cousin who has been missing for a decade, ever where I should forget I's own vagrancy. Who were you before I? Speaking of beginnings. Here, beginning the unbeginning, owning nothing but that wounding sense of waking to speak as I would. After the floods, then, after women unlike Eve giving kind to the so-and-so, telling them it is time to be unnavigable, after calling them back to what the tongue cuts, speaking the thing of them, rolled into stone, speaking I, after all theories of abandonment, priced and displayed, the word was a moonlit knife with those arrivants lifting their hems to dance, toeless, with the footless child they invent. Here I wanders into a court in spring, desperate to keep the word for self-record, where the water is broken with lilies floating like chapeau, and coming back like women softly singing, the singing spectacle in itself, all of I passing among them. What can be holy here, if I's troubles are not with God, as they say? I is prepared for the barbarous trembling, how it could end. Here at the edge, where the others in the wake feed themselves agave, the heaven they know beginning with syrup, their hairs retreating with the data of nuclear bomb tests. Who will make humor in this nervous, tangled play? In the last act, of course, to be unlike anything happy, living as I knows, layer upon layer know. Living is continuous. What grows within, studying to be let out, to beguile I as alleged or a sewn mouth, or what could be whole, or life, or lust, or diagnosis, a more flawless name for I, who wants to keep what you are after, where I walks the split-tongued edge, begging for nil, like the dinosaurs. Yes, those who heard the waves, but seeing nothing in the darkness, not yet anyone swallowed into the 24-hour clock. Here you and I both hear this, and you find in I nothing you want, nothing that can be easy with I as a starting point, as you then cast I to chronicle, to scrub words into timesheets, Call I the narrator, but wanting nothing of the enzyme turning speech into carcinogen the minute air meets it in the mouth. A half-headed thing, remembering to hoof the human, a last act of self-preservation, undying fiction, something begun in precurse, formless, as though hungered for mutant offerings. Eyes people, to victors with name like Somerset. But what about Jejune? Jejune has known I. They were children once, children holding their heads up at the aquarium of ill-conceived enterprise. But that be all you need to know. The dysgraphist must lend the mouth to the flood of oil beneath the Gulf of Mexico. The waves doing their best to save us from America. The premonition of coins, given plumage, red, jaune, bleu, echo, orange. The children who know their job, know to never be done with answering the unanswerable. Dinu kileskila, to never raise a hand or shield themselves against some agent of decay. Lithographic forms of having to commit to the speaking, bluer than perpetual lines of black tears. You meet I, now the elder one, wanting a haunting with Jejune, though all of that is too much to ask. It is difficult to live in the dark. I knows the dark is difficult as abandoned artifacts. Abandoned artifacts like graveyards of ships in the blueprint of wrecked wars. Wrecked wars known to Jejune as the 11 lost in Deepwater Horizon, oil and gas, ignited for 48 hours in 60,000 gallons of the dark. Permit an escape to the engineers still alive and brave in this dark. Then stop immediately, man. Then hit I again. After 84 days, a facsimile, be sure to offer milk. Then ask Jejune whether I will cry if you die, whether something of the pirates and all the ones they sold live here still. De causa naturel, de causa nostra, lay I, now the younger one, bear in thoughts, bear in eye complications. Jejune does not want it paid in simple tongue. But let I go, given the choice now to speak. After 500 years of dysgraphia, let I approach the witness stand in any chosen language. Let I bend into a touch of the supernatural. Let that be all you need to know. Where the heart is bruised with unfeeling, to delay the organ's devotion to devotion is not belief, or it is calling I to walk out of the sea. All of the world hears the surf supply applause. Here's Jejune swimming in, Jejune outlawed in the notes of 50 generations, far from that door of even more unopenings. How to pay for the vocal injury I feels at the end of the Gulf of Mexico. The one wrecks, seeds still in jars after a century. How the sea hacks the compass still. I feels how far is left to go. Sudan, Abaco, Aleppo, still before the self-same notes of dead musicians consider I more than the pen. And to have never thought of the notes as autobio, and to have never built a better world to inhabit or break. Speaking Jejune, I has screwed up, I knows it, and how to pay for it instead. I hammers the joke's humorless record with a love, a marrow. And what is marrow? if not the loss of the right to scrub vain as words clean. The work is honorless, preoccupied with definition. The word is always to understand. Of course, why else the brain? Why else the heart sending blood upward? Why else here and everywhere, everything still erupting and unsayable? Jeju knows it is other people who cry out on the news, who risk loam and life on treacherous waters, a homing, to spread the years on a couch and be caught in a comforting web of verdict. Later, Jejun leaves her eyes with a letter that they be laid down on pillowed pills. Dear suicide, dear vex, dear sex, two-minded, something better, physio, mutely. So when they find the eyes and they say, look, someone's eyes are left here. Here also is a whole banana parsimony in two hands. In the mind, release I, as though the birds, sure to return across this distance, exposed to the sunlight, even as the bridge will be gone, even as the mothers and all landmarks for rest declare the mainland, the just waking fort of beasts. You are so seen, so clear, Jejun, given to I before a court. Jejun understands the signature will wipe I out. I, as the tobaccoed air, the tongue-tied heaviness of striking this act of permanent residence with debris given to the children who ripen to vitamin loss, somewhere far off from Malawi, from Manzanilla. Who else is a mothering anagram, Jejun? Who keeps the cloth rough to investigate its lure of an origin? Pushing these fallen few facts 7 dozen yards away, Jejun invites the council, the jurors, others even impossible in their constitution, for wine, to ease the work through the years it would take to pay for sense. Between reasons to arrive, why else would living be continuous? Check here or any other box, the judge reminds Jejun, to arrive without a reservation, to hold the judge to the work of a body astray. Jejun, now waking the judge, arrives, unflagging the morning understood in this drying version of a faith. And to be Jejun, Jejun must speak without the counterfeit luxury of many zeros, that I will be loved, and as long as they both shall live, yet with some sedition, and God knows what, struck through herself. But love, it is 1 hour before the morning ties your tongue to every tercet here. 1 hour before the loved world arrives by the wild of our tongue. The talking of atoms, 90 degrees from the sun. Return now, Jejun, to this palette, stretching a hand to whatever symbol is an exit. Jejun, expel these gallstones. Forgive I's stealth. And true enough, explain these least remembered things are beyond defense, where no one is born well enough pristine, except in dreams, of course, where language is kept clean. For the girl here, still wiry, hiding a meal in the white tree, sure that no one will find it until Jejun, fourth of the ordinary faults the last hour has misplaced. First of the name. Yet to be great in this gathering, the voice must bend toward apology. The tiredness of growing cold. Invade the wages of simple deaths. Sorry, Jejun says, Jejun is sorry. But for whom and what has I arrived? For whom does this dam fill the sky? These molecules blind eaten from that distance, as everything I learned about disappearance reigns lifetimes spent in this catastrophic crowd. So what if a wormhole? So what if the woman who wakes with jejune is reduced, irrigated, salted, harvested, and thrown again to exclamation points motored in the desert, with no word for anything needing built by hand? The mechanism of the spring, plains showering powdered milk into the ville. I remembers the lake clotting and jejune disappearing into drought long before starvation, long before the woman whose children live a whole particle away from theory, whose footnotes lodge the throat, the hours, and provoke jejune to marvel at our good fortune. Next to mothers, with all their wailing annulled somehow, the motor towing jejune this whole while. This thing big enough for laughter, an exhumed patois. Jejune never asks it why. Jejune only defends I. What do you have? And what have you tried to save? Thank you.
Thank you, Molly and Canisia, for those lovely readings and for the work that you are doing in poetic form. That really helps us to think deeply about the work of language and about the cultural times that we are in. It's striking for me that the manner in which Molly makes use of pop culture to kind of offer critique of the world that we're in. And striking for me, Canisia, the way in which you have structured this subject, eye searching, thinking, speaking persona in the disgraphics, that really opens up the question of what it means to live in the shadow, in the ongoing shadow of colonialism and its late modern appearances. So thank you very much for those readings. I think I'm going to turn over to Judith to maybe ask her first question, which is, and I think you should ask that number one question.
You mean the number two question?
No, the one, both, it's about inspiration.
Okay. He said like nix that one, but now Ronaldo, you're gonna say I'm doing it. This is a wild night. We're being wild. Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was next.
Oh no, you can ask it.
Okay. Okay. So we're very curious about what poets and writers inspire your work and how you reference gratitude or appreciation or your desire to be in conversation with them. And I think we ask this because actually gratitude isn't necessarily intuitive for the artist, for the scholar, and for the student, who often admires quite quietly. But we know yet how important it is. So please.
I can give you a little break from talking, Canisia. Your reading was really stunning. It's so grand, and you know, I don't know, I just like got into a bit of a trance there. That was really stunning. So there are a few poets that I'm directly in conversation with in this book, and I think that's my way of showing gratitude, is to name them in the work. So I read one of those poems today, You Think You Know Your Life, which takes its title from a line in Hera Lindsay Bird's book of poems, and I've got that book right here. The book is actually called Hera Lindsay Bird by Hera Lindsay Bird, which I think is so badass, to just name your book your own name. And that's her. That's a photo of her on the cover as well. So I wanted to pay homage to her in this book because her book gave me permission to drop the guise of the speaker being someone other than myself, because I really am just writing from my own perspective about my own memories and experiences. So it was encouraging to see another poet really lean into the idea of truth telling and revealing the self, which obviously became very important to me when writing my own book. And then I've got a poem after the poet Monica McClure, which is called When We're Young and Insecure About Our Intelligence. And I took that title from a throwaway comment that she made on a panel once at a writer's conference, because I thought the idea of it so perfectly encapsulated how I felt about being young. Like I just needed to be 35 and then I'd feel smart enough to live a life that was important or something like that. So I just love the concept of when we're young and insecure about our intelligence. And then the third poet that I reference in my book is Rosanna Dearchild, who wrote the collection Calling Down the Sky, in which she inhabits her own mother's voice, speaking about being in residential schools. And the poem that I wrote after Rosanna is called Pinky Drum, and it takes the form of a voicemail my mom left me talking about how it feels to be Métis. And I just loved how Rosanna's voicing of her mother's experiences didn't feel like appropriation, but instead felt like a gesture of love. And I wanted to do the same thing with my poem. And there are obviously a ton of other poets that are inspirational to me, but I'll pass it on to Canisia.
Okay. Yeah, inspiration. It's such an odd word for me, mainly because of the kind of cliched expectation that something is tapping you on the shoulder and zapping you into knowledge or thought or something. But the way that I like to put it is for me, writing is a practice of relation. It is a way of being in and thinking about the world artistically, among others. And there are writers who model this kind of work for me. And I always, forever will shout out Dion Brand, because if I had not come upon Brand's work, I probably might not be sitting here in this room with you. And that is mainly because it was not until I read Brand that my own sense of musicality and poetry and a kind of political and an ethical lens actually came into synthesis. That didn't happen until I read Brand's books. No Language is Neutral, Land to Light On, specifically. Those were the ones that opened the door. And certainly I learned many other things from other writers like Kamal Brathwaite. I love the way that Kamal Brathwaite exists in language. There's something alchemical to his thinking, such that the language itself is inseparable from the sentiments and the kind of critiques and the shape of knowing that he offers. When you're in a Kamal poem, you're in something that's very spectacularly alchemical. There's Derek Walcott. I came to learn how you bring desperate things into a kind of conversation. You put things that appear to be completely different next to each other and find actually the way that they echo something significant. And so the way that he uses metaphor in this way that is completely surprising, the way he draws significance from different disparate places. I certainly learned that in Walcott. And so, those were kind of the early, that's the early triangulation for me. And those continue still, certainly. Brand is a continuing guiding light. And in the Disgraphist itself, what I found was I had to think multiply, not just about the self and the subject position of the I, but about art and art making generally, and how that opens up systems of knowing and systems of troubling what appears to be, a kind of solid, a solid kind of structure about the way one can enter the world and critique and have an opinion, and so I found that in many different registers. Simone Schwartz-Bart's The Bridge of Beyond just did something really interesting to the way that the eco was presented. It's like you have to see the world that's completely familiar in this haunting new way. Dion Brand's The Blue Clerk, that sort of roving haptic thinking that's happening there. Fred Moten with this concept of the blur, Black and Blur, Saidiya Hartman, with the sort of wayward thinking in her most recent book. Patrick Chamazo's Texaco did another thing with language as well. Nicole Silly. So Ronaldo Walcott, his thinking kinship through queer returns. And so it's never that inspiration strikes in this sort of monolingual way. It's many different things. The work of Basquiat, the music of Nicholas Payton, all of these things open doors in their unique ways and sort of lend to the work what the work needs, and so I put all of that usually in my notes section, my acknowledgement section, to say these are the people who accompanied me through this work. So that's one of the ways that I do it.
If I might follow up from that, particularly because of something you said in responding to the provocation, the probe, let's call it a probe, Canisia. And you mentioned the question of making meaning. I'm wondering if both of you might talk a little bit about how you work with words, what we might call method, and your use of the precision of words as a poet, to evoke meaning, emotion, to intervene into cultural settlement in our time, the sense that, there's some things that are settled, we sorted it out. And then the poet comes along, and with the precision of a word, the precision of a lyric, the break in a line, undoes all of that. And I wonder if you guys can talk about that a little bit.
Molly, you want to go?
Yeah. So I like to use humor in my work, mainly because I think jokes are the most effective way to relay a message without making the reader feel talked at. And I also use quite crude language, which I think is a way of intervening in the assumptions of how a woman should talk and want and feel. For example, I wrote a one-act play for two of my male friends a few years ago, which they performed at the Winnipeg Fringe Festival. And one of the reviewers gave us a 2-star review, which is fine. But in his review, he wrote that he was surprised to find out a woman had written the play because it was far too crude and unrealistic. But the thing is, I was pulling conversations almost verbatim from the two women that I was living with for this play between two men. And so still, after all this time, there's this cultural expectation for women to embody politeness and quietude, which is just total bullshit. But even so, I did pull back the language a little bit during the editing process for Exhibitionist, because I had a friend go through it and she counted all the times I said fuck. And I think it was something ridiculous, like 47 times, 47 occurrences of fuck. And she said, listen, I know this is your style and I don't want to get in the way of your style, but it's still a strong word that evokes strong emotions in people. And readers might miss the important things that you're trying to say because they're so caught up in the fox. And I was really grateful to her for saying that, because in the process of trying to undo the industry's expectations of women writers in the language that they should be using, I was losing some of the poeticism. And it's a much better book because of dialing back that harsh language even just a little bit. You, Canisia?
Yeah, I appreciate this question, Ronaldo. And just listening to what Molly was saying there about social expectations of decorum, and you know, this is kind of what I was gesturing to when I said earlier that I appreciate how you're disrupting this sense of respectability on many of those levels. But you know, I think for me, perhaps on a more philosophical level, I think we live in a really prosaic world, which is to say that narrative and its various structures, its various modes, has become enmeshed with order and capital and nation in a way that I think deadens people's imaginations. And the functional way that language is deployed in that mode continuously creates these emergencies. And I actually mean emergencies explicitly, literally. It creates these emergencies that by mere force of how ordinary these deployments of language and the prosaic meanings and the prosaic arrangements of the world, by mere force of how common they are, the emergencies themselves are subsumed into a kind of invisibility, because language is just it's so natural to us as a species. But what is not natural, but is continuously deployed as though it is natural, is writing. Writing is a technology, and the way that that technology is used to prop up these systems is so fundamentally flawed, I think, that, you know, is something that has caught my attention, and I have been thinking about it deeply for a long time. And so I think something, some kind of counterpoint is needed. And I think it's really in one of the oldest art forms that we have, which is an art form that predates the page, that predates what is written, which is poetry itself. I think the poetic order of knowledge allows for the linearity of prosaic meaning to be interrupted, for a kind of chunking of what the world is into something unexpected and surprising, for syntactic collapse, to collapse the syntax of ordinary prosaic functional language, for speech to be rearranged, realigned, conjugated in these ways outside of what Aimé Césaire calls the great silence of scientific knowledge. And so I'm a writer who's concerned with the sense of the movement of things from like that hyper order of narrative to an otherwise, which is concerned with freedom and liberation and waking up the imagination. And so I think poetic consciousness can bring to bear the tendency that we have towards what of the world and the self is taken into concentrated sensibility, and then smashed and deadened and disturbed by the ways that capital rules the world that we have. And so I think the force of poetic compression disrupts that somehow. And one of the ways that I think people sort of default to, well, poetry is intimidating. Yeah, it should be intimidating because of all this heavy lifting that it's doing, you know? And so what if we are challenged? It's what we need. Truly, we need to be challenged in these many ways. And, you know, Molly does it with her humor and that sort of cross-cutting acidic language, and others of us do it in many different ways, you know, but I think at its best, poetry sort of captures and mobilizes this energy of interrupting the prosaic through the work of the poetic line to disturb these calcified structures and those cliched rhythms of thought and expression, so that the world can open up newly to us somehow.
Thank you both for those really brilliant answers. I'm going to turn it to Judy. Judy, maybe we can get one more question in before we turn it to the audience.
Yeah, or like one for each poet. Is that?
No, yeah, you can do. Yeah, you go ahead. You take the reins.
Sorry. All right. So one of the purposes of this research seminar, I think, is to indicate and make the argument that poetry is not illustration, it is theorization. And, you know, most of us, many of us have been sitting in Kenosha and sitting in Brunswick, Georgia, right? And there are two themes, Canisia, from your two concepts from your poems that kept coming up for me when I was watching CNN. One was a species of amnesiacs, a species of amnesiacs. Another was empire's wildfire. I mean, these concepts encourage theorization, attend to exhibit theorization, and also actually keep you from falling onto the ground in watching CNN. And so I just want to ask, you know, your books, each of them have pointed theorizations of anti-racism, and they build on one another. And I wonder if you could speak to that process, that theorization. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for the question, Judith. So I mean, I appreciate this added context here with you pulling out the phrases "empire's wildfire" and a species of amnesiacs, because I think it's a kind of it's necessary to look at the materials of the language that a poet uses in what you aptly express as theorizing. Yes, I think, you know, poetry is a kind of theorizing, a kind of analytic about the world, which is also expressive, which is also revelatory, and it gets reduced to illustration a lot, especially for certain people, certainly non-white people, who are constantly sort of wrangled into these hyper autobiographical configurations of something called identity. But I think there's something similar happening with the concept of anti-racism. And my work is not concerned with anti-racism. I don't think that is not what I do. And so my books really are concerned with Black livingness, what is to be alive at this moment in time in the Black diaspora. And I don't think Black life can be surmised in its richness, in its fullness, in its expansiveness in any of those reductive metrics. And certainly this sort of popular conceptualization of something called anti-racism is not my concern. You know, as Dion Brand puts it, you know, we live from the center of our lives, and it's sort of that is the place that we write from. And so I think if there is a kind of theorization that's happening, certainly there is multiple in my works. It's about the actual measures by which Black people live and survive, given the history that has brought us to this place. And then I sort of pull from these various disciplines, you know, whether it's science or mathematics or physics or, you know, the history of literature and sociology and all of that, to sort of braid something that to me gives me an adequate way to hold what I see of the world in language toward what is possible. It's always about a kind of futurity, right? So I will resist the anti-racism framework because it's really, that's not what I do. But because we live in the world that we live in, I can certainly see how that can brush up against what I'm trying to do in those two books, for sure.
Oh, I love that answer. I think I will echo some of those sentiments in that, because when you first asked the question, you were talking about theorizing anti-racism, I was thinking, okay, do I do that? And I'm not so sure.
I can be fair to say I came up with questions each specifically for one of you. So that what I wasn't sure, but please answer. This is so interesting to me for you to be in conversation. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, writing specifically about race, about indigeneity, I wanted to represent the multiplicitousness of indigeneity. It's been an interesting experience publishing this book because there are a lot of white editors and reviewers who want to take the poems from my book that are specifically about being Métis and sort of separate them out and say, these are the Indigenous poems. These are the regular poems, and then these are the Indigenous poems. And it's a ridiculous concept to me because they're all Métis poems. They've been written by a Métis person. And, I don't have to be writing about blood quantum or smudging or, growing up on the res to have written an Indigenous poem. I didn't grow up on the res. That's not my experience to share. But the experiences that I have shared are still Indigenous. And I guess I'm hoping that my book will help to help readers understand how you can't project archetypes onto writers just because they're writers and they should fit into the idea of what Indigenous lit is. So yeah, I don't know. That's just my 2 cents about that question.
Thank you to both of you. Ronaldo, do you want to ask question 7? And then we'll open it up. Because this was a question Molly was intrigued by.
You go ahead and ask the question and then we open.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. So Molly, I'm going to just read this question because what I was seeing in your poetry was too complicated for me to actually even remember. So many of your poems seem to almost try to run ahead of heterosexuality's harms and to recast them as pleasure or not completely harm or harmless harm. And so I wanted to know if there was an argument or theorization in the Exhibitionist about the best case scenario for intimacy, for heterosexual imaginings, or like what's the best case scenario in the wildest dreams of the author of The Exhibitionist?
Yeah, I really love this question. I think because it wasn't something I realized I was doing until you told me I was doing it. And that's, I think, really exciting for a poet when other people notice some aspect of your poetics that you weren't really conscious of. So it kind of like realivened some things that have felt stagnant. So I appreciated the question. And looking back on the book, you're totally right. And I think the reason for that feeling is that I've always loved sex, and I'm approaching it from a baseline understanding that sex is good. So whenever something harmful happens in relation to sex, it's always like this backwards movement from a positive place. And it's always framed with the understanding that even though, this shitty thing just happened, sex is still joyful. And when it's good, it's really good. And I understand that that is a completely privileged perspective, that, nothing so bad has ever happened to me during sex that I wouldn't want to have it anymore. I don't want to ignore that, because even though, I have been harmed, I have not been traumatized, and I'm obviously very grateful for that. But in the wildest dreams of the speaker, who is me, I think that she imagines a kind of intimacy that is playful and kind, and in which there's mutual care and a balance of power, because those are the things that have been lacking so far in her romantic life. So that's my answer. Thank you for the question.
You can place your questions in the chat, and if you are in this room with us and you want to ask a question, you can on mic and show your video and ask your question as well. So either the chat, if you're in this room with us, you can ask your question orally. Sorry, not in the chat, in the Q&A. Judith, do you want to ask another one of your questions as we wait for questions to come in?
You know, I feel like calling on people.
No.
No, I know, that's really mean. All right, I'll ask one more while folks are sort of thinking. So for both poets, and I guess the reason I'm asking these themes is because I would say that of all of the brilliant diversity of our doctoral students, these two concepts seem to come up like very, very often for students. And one of them is trauma and the other is memory. So I wonder if each of you could speak about how they figure into your work and how you approach them. And I'm grateful. I know this is hard work to answer this question, but I know that this is really on the minds of our students in their work in all of its urgency a lot. Okay, thanks.
I can go first. Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit already in my framing statement at the beginning, but so much of my book takes place post-breakup, post-abuse, post-trauma, post-childhood. And my speaker actually doesn't do a lot in the book. Towards the end, she starts like sleeping around a little bit and you get to see like her sexcapades. But mostly it's a book of remembrances and reckonings and fantasies about a future where these harms and shames are reversed in her. And she's pretty stagnant sometimes and almost wallowing, but she's healing throughout the whole book, slowly and steadily. She is healing. And there's one poem in particular that really digs into trauma and memory, and that one is called Dear Mr. Decker. And it's a direct address or an epistolary poem to the teacher who taught sex ed when I was in 6th grade. It's the longest poem in the book. It's 12 pages. And it explores all the ways that young people are set up for failure in their sexual lives. And it would be laughable if it weren't like so violent and irresponsible. But in this poem, I bring up past instances of sexual harm. So it's an intense poem, but one that I think the book needed because so much of that childhood and teenage sexual trauma informs my relationship with sex even today, and just relationship outside of sex as well. It just, that's the stuff that stays with you.
Yeah, I don't work with trauma as a thematic. I wouldn't know what to do with that actually. In any kind of approach to crafting something literary, I don't think in those terms, in terms of trauma. Memory, yes. But because I am, again, writing from my positionality as a woman in Black diaspora, I write from that space of a historical awareness of slavery and colonialism. Those certainly are traumatic things, yes. But I think the dominant conceptualization of trauma is doing that thing that I was talking about in my previous response to anti-racism. It tends to be reduced to the enclosure of autobiography and the hyper-personal, when really what I'm trying to think of is on the level of the large-scale structural problems that exist, and then build the sort of specificity of a life and a body moving through these things, right? And so what I attend to is the world, you know, and what it is to live and die in the world, what it means to be alive in the world, and just mere point of fact that I write in and through and about Black life and Black diaspora is to encounter memory and to encounter those really difficult and traumatic structural things that tend to be that are constantly reduced to the personal and the autobiographical. But I think to reckon with Blackness always is to reckon with the political. And there's so much refusal of the politics of living in this space and time that even within a context where the sort of world that I attend to, not in the typical way that people tend to think of trauma, but I think memory is important for me because it's involved in how any of us maneuver through our lives, through the world, how we know, how we don't know. It just becomes politicized in this way of trauma bonded knowledge for non-white people that sort of disturbs really what should be viewed as the structural, you know. And I think a lot of people have trouble thinking through the structural, and it might be because the world that most people know is a kind of illusory world, you know. It could be that sort of strange thing, but at the same time, you're constantly coming up against what is real, what is, and so it's in that space that I find the tension of existing as a writer and an artist, and the kinds of materials that I tend to write about, as being dependent on what is remembered and what is re-remembered in the manner of Toni Morrison's remembering, you know. So this is just one of the ways that I want to think about it.
We have two questions. The first question is for Molly, and then I'll come to the second question. So to Molly, Renee Mahal asks, Molly, in Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, she says, quote, to move through shame, you have to sit in it, end quote. Did you feel that this book was a way of sitting in shame to move through it? Did you come into writing with the motivation of working through past and present shames, or was that a byproduct of writing?
Oh, that's a great question. I sat in the shame for a long time before I started writing the book. And I think I had to come to a place where I was rejecting it before I could actually start writing about it. I didn't have, I don't know if it's the knowledge or the strength to approach some of this stuff, because even like as 18 years old, to think about writing a poem in which I describe, I've got one poem where I talk about Dutch ovening my dog. Like if my 18-year-old self knew that someday I would be putting that in a book and showing the world, she would be absolutely mortified. And so I wasn't working through it as much while I was writing, but I had done a lot of that work beforehand. I love that concept though, and I'm sure some of that was happening while I was writing. And then what is the second part? Did you come into writing with the motivation of working through passive? Yeah, a bit. I know everyone says, you know, poetry isn't supposed to be therapy. Well, sometimes it kind of is. Sometimes it is therapy, and I don't know that I did it on purpose, but it definitely happened where exhibiting some of these hurts helped me to feel either not alone or helped to de-escalate some of those feelings or de-energize it maybe. So yes, yeah, thanks for that question. That was really great.
Okay, thank you. And from Sho Yamaguchika, how does it feel to have your poetry enter into the landscape of nationalism that informs how we read and circulate, in quotation marks, Canadian literature? Is Canada at times an inevitable landscape or backdrop? Is being immersed in Canada fundamentally a form of violence, or is there a potentially redeemable space in the way this collective forms? And I think that's for both of you.
Well, since Molly just went on, I'll respond to this really briefly. Thank you, Sho, for the question. Yeah, I don't have any fealty to nationalism, whatever, you know. This is not something that forms part of my own imagination, right? I am interested in what transcends all of these reductive and exclusionary and violent enclosures. And so Canadian literature that you put in quotation marks, I appreciate the quotation marks there, as a category is useful for certain things, right? But like I said, I am writing in both a metaphysical and psychological and imaginative space that is Black diaspora, that is in fact transcending of these sort of reductive, cartographic, violent ways of thinking. So that you draw a line between Canada and what you call a fundamental form of violence probably speaks for itself. But we have always made our lives, we've always made the means to our survival and to being rich, and we make those formations in spite of those larger systems, right? And I don't think we should confuse those two things, right? And I think for me, what's enriching are the spaces of our living and relation and imagination, and that escape these harms that are otherwise, you know. And I think they know that I can't really control necessarily where my poetry goes and how it's interpreted and used. What I can control is my own active creation in it, which isn't for me, is not committed at all to these categories and these enclosures. Right?
I agree with everything you just said. And I would just add, like, I don't think Canada is inevitable. I think it's temporary. And I truly feel like by the time I am an old woman, Canada will not exist in the way that it does now, by the name Canada, because it just feels so weak. The whole idea of what Canada is and what Canadian literature is feels really unstable and not built to stand the test of time because of the way it has been constructed. Mm-hmm. So I would say no, it's not an inevitable landscape or backdrop. We feel it now very intensely in this time, but I think the time is coming where we're going to say goodbye to a lot of those colonial structures and governing bodies and concepts, talking specifically about literature.
Molly says in her lifetime, okay?
Those were great answers, and yeah, definitely Molly's insistence on a future that is ahead of us, that is other than what we have right now, is to use the word you're not feeling, Canisia, is inspiring.
That is inspiring. That is the proper use of the word.
From Alyssa Trox to both Canisia and Molly, thank you for those beautiful readings and the thoughtful answers to the questions from Ronaldo and Judy. I am struck by the way in which performance infuses the poetic form in both of your approaches. And as you know, performance has its own intellectual genealogy in women and gender studies too. Canisia, this is obvious in the structure of your most recent and gorgeous collection. And today you spoke of, quote, the drama of being alive, end quote. Molly, we see this in the title of your collection, The Exhibitionist. And you also describe your refinement of form as a kind of rehearsal in your opening remarks. I wondered if you could reflect on what performance enables or opens up for you as a way of living against or in spite of or outside of constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to go ahead, Canisia?
Sure, why not? That's a great question, Alyssa. Thank you for that. Performance. That's a really interesting thing, because actually one of the core ideas that I was working with very early on in crafting this poem is this very idea, of this sense of the performance of selfhood, of that we have to perform according to the categories that predetermine our condition for living in social structures, right? So whether that when you enter the world, you come in not giving a shit about any category, right? I think we can all probably assume that. And then we have to enter into these various performances of self based on what these categories are asking us. So who is a mother, who is a father, who is a woman, who's a man, what religious belief you can have, this is this sort of conditioning of how you go to school and what that does in how it shapes your future. And so it's just an endless series of testing out how well we can perform in these various categories, something called the human. And and it's really this core thing that made me think more deeply about who exactly animates these categories that amount to what it is to be quote unquote human, and how do these categorizations work in the actual as well as in theoretical. And so, I mean, I could lean into Sylvia Wynter and and other thinkers in thinking about how to disturb this concept. Yeah, that a new human is possible, and not only possible, in fact, that I think we live a different human beneath in that subterranean way, in a subterranean way that is, in a sense, whether it's explicit or not, or metaphorical, is pushing back against this this colonial notion of the human, right? And so part of the expressivity of performance is really what I was looking at. You know, how it is that we can be a person, several versions of Moten's consent to not being a single being, how it is that we are enabled into repeating these sorts of deadly performances, deadening performances, while at the same time having such strong desires for liberation and something otherwise, you know? And so I think that the structure of the play allowed me that kind of formal shifting of register, of tone, of being, because even Jejun as a character changes. You know, in one act, Jejun could be a mother, a brother, a father, a mother, and it's all the same voice reconfigured around this idea and this sensibility of performance of self. And so, you know, what really I'm trying to dig into this sense of how is it that we can still relate to each other beyond the sort of really weird colonial idea of the human being Adamic and white and straight and Christian, you know? So, yeah.
I don't know that I have much to add. That was very succinct, but I would just say that with my own work, I think the use of bringing performance into the world of the book of poems is it allows me to show what I want to show. And I think I tried to get at that concept with the last poem in the book about vulnerability and how it's kind of a double-edged sword where, you know, my goal with the book was to sort of show everyone who I am and what my life is really like, to reflect my inner life. But if you give too much, then people are going to take it in the way that they want to anyways. So while trying to exhibit authenticity, you're actually, you can't control the way that someone experiences you. So yeah, I think that was one of those sort of complicated things I was trying to work into my book that I don't fully understand myself, but something that definitely feels like it's going to be part of my writing practice forever, because I'm really almost obsessed with the idea of authenticity and how to be authentic.
Okay, I think we'll take one last question, and then yes, and then we'll. This is a question for you, Canisia, from Rui. Thank you so much for your brilliant performance of the Dysgraphist. I wanted to ask about the way I works throughout the text as an unsettling ploy, which I heard as the homonym I, and how the Dysgraphics as EYE, and how the Dysgraphist pushes against the regimes of visuality that dominate liberal modernity.
Thank you, Ru, for that question. A brilliant one at that. Certainly, you're correct in sort of contextualizing the way that I deploy the I as a mode of unsettling. So yes, that's exactly what I intended. And my main method is that I quadrupled the syntactic structure of the I, or what we would typically expect the I to be. The I is always first person singular. In the Dysgraphist, I deploy the I as first person singular, second person singular, third person plural, and in the sort of third person omniscient Jejun. It's all the same, I, right? So that in itself unsettles from the very beginning. The the sort of comfort that we have in English syntax, where one speaks authoritatively and absolutely in the sort of vertical figuration of I as subject position, right? And so for me, that sort of quadrupling of the address to the I is my own way of bringing the collective into what I found to be the kind of disturbing egotism of the lyric I, right? I wanted to question my discomfort, my deep discomfort with the lyric I, which I had pushed away for a long time, right? It was in Dion Brand's graduate poetry workshop where almost to the end of the semester, she said to me, Canisia, where is your I poem? You need to write me an I poem, right? What is this? And certainly, yes, I went away and I wrote an I poem. Was it good? No, because I was still, I was still sort of warped. My poetic sensibilities were still warped by what I found to be that sort of deadly vertical deployment of the I. That egotism seemed way too much for me. And I couldn't really handle how that singular lyric register sounds the same across the entire spectrum of English lyric verse. You know, if indeed what it is a kind, if entering lyric poetry is a kind of fragmentizing way to offer it, quote unquote, it nearly to see in a kind of specific, particular way, why is it that we all sound the same? And so, you know, I just never really found my place in that register of the lyric I. And it was Dion Brand's prompt, which sent me toward this book, because I never forgot the way she saw me, and that had never happened in any of my undergraduate classes or anything like that. This was the first time anyone actually saw my discomfort and wondered why is it that I never used the I in my poems. And so that became the measure of my investigation into the sort of neoliberal dominating sphere of sort of individualism and meritocracy and all of these lies that they tell us, right? And it is in leaning into Edouard Glissant's concept of opacity, I was able to trouble what you call the visuality that dominates liberal modernity. You know, that is the place where I was able to disturb that, right? By leaning into Edouard Glissant's opacity and thinking through Christina Sharp's concept of dysgraphia in her book In the Wake on Blackness and Being, how certain narratives cohere and are disseminated at rapid speed again and again and again, that criminalize, pathologize, and otherwise denigrate Black people. And so it was in this way that I found the EYE, the outward facing I. That is also part of the collective sensibility that I was born into in the Caribbean. Even when we speak, there's a sense of the collective. There's a kind of hyper awareness that it's more than one person speaking. That there's a certain responsibility to being beyond simply the self. Palace of the Peacock, I think, does a similar thing with that disturbing the I, and that Rastafarian concept of I and I and I. It's not simply, you know, this one endlessly harping, navel gazing ego. There's many. So thank you for the question.
Judith, let me turn it back over to you. We're almost at 6, and maybe you can take us out.
I'm so moved and delighted. I have also 6 pages of notes I've taken on your poetry and your reflections on your writing, and I know I'm not the only one. And I do want this research seminar to be an invitation, a very serious invitation to our community to take poets' theorizations into your work, to take them up. And that's, you know, a very serious challenge and a very worthwhile challenge, I think. But as Canisia says, it's scary. People are scared of poetry. As Molly says, my honesty might embarrass my younger self even, and yet it's worth it, right?
Mhm.
And then sort of informally in this place of, you know, fear and sadness and anxiety, this that we're in as we head closer to joining one another again in the classroom in January. I just want you to see actually carrying around books of poetry as a kind of salve, as a kind of a space of courage. And if you have nothing to say and you feel bored by yourself, as don't we all, having been so alone for so long, you can offer a poem by one of these two poets instead that has you thinking. And that is a beautiful gift. And that is a beautiful invitation. So I really want to thank Ronaldo for doing this with me, Elisa, and for letting us, and Molly and Canisia for joining us. And Ronaldo, you have to have the last word after that.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you, Canisia, and thank you all who came this afternoon to hear these two wonderful and amazing poets not only read their work, but share the thinking of their process with us, and to theorize with us a little bit, and to share some time in community with us. So thank you, and have a good rest of the day, of the night, wherever you might be.
Thank you, Ronaldo. Thank you, Judy. Thank you all.
Okay.
Molly,
Bye-bye.
lovely to see you.